Oh, hello there, dear. I've been expecting you.
Hello and welcome to the Art of Conversation. My name is Lance Gardner and I'm here tonight with Thao Nguyen and My-Linh Le, two people who are very dear to KQED and who have both been featured more than once on various programs and to the best of my knowledge, who have not appeared together here on KQED or I don't think anywhere else except maybe in Get Out the Vote programs over the course of last year. So I'm very excited to have these two brilliant artists here to talk about how they intersect, how they diverge, and how they like to think about art. So Thao and My-Linh, welcome to the Art of Conversation. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course, I'm a big fan of both of your work, and I think that you do very different things, and they present to the audience very differently. But I think there are a lot of places where you intersect, not only as artists, but as human beings and as Americans. And so I actually I want to start back in Vietnam. Actually, you know, coincidentally, today happens to be the 46th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, and so I wonder, both of you as Vietnamese Americans and children of refugees, how you came to know Vietnam. What was your concept of Vietnam in your youth, either the country or the war?
Do you want to go first, Tao, or
Sure. And Lance, I just want to address. I think the volume, your volume has gone really low. So
how's that? Is that better?
Oh, that's great.
Sorry.
Thank you. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, I absolutely will. What a brilliant start to this wonderful conversation. I was just talking about how great you both are, and then I was wondering what your understanding of Vietnam was as in your youth, either the country or the war as Americans. How did you get introduced to the concept of Vietnam, and what was it that you had, Thao?
Mm-hmm. Sure. My concept of Vietnam was where a lot of my family lived, and the way my parents referred to it, it was just back home. And it was, I mean, I was well into my late 20s or 30s before there was real conversation around the war, because that is such a source of, I'll say that with my mom, we didn't really discuss the war until I was well into my adulthood. And I think that was because it's such a source of grief and sorrow. It was sort of off limits. And she'd talk a lot about her time in her life before the war, but never actually what happened during it. And and she fled before the fall of Saigon. And so I had this daily interaction with it. And it was this place that I didn't know if I would ever get to see. I didn't, throughout my childhood and again, well into my adulthood, it was never really an option to go. And it was, it was always this source of intrigue and mystery to me, because I knew so much about it, and I even referred to it as home, but it's a place I'd never been.
What about you, My-Linh?
I grew up in San Jose, So it was like its own little country in a way. All of my friends, like everybody I grew up around was also Vietnamese. Their parents immigrated as well. My older siblings were born in Vietnam. And so there was very much like, it was almost as if Vietnam, the country, was like an extension of us. So it didn't feel as much as like a foreign place or like a conceptual thing. It was more like, um, you know, it's so hard to explain because my parents would constantly remind us that we're not American. Early on anyway. Now they're like they've gone a completely different way, but in the beginning, they constantly reminded us that we were not white, and so we were not to behave like what they thought how they thought white people behaved or Americans behaved. And so it was kind of confusing because once I did finally visit Vietnam, which I was pretty young when I did, it must have been, I forget what year I went, but I was in middle school, I believe. So it was very, once I got there, it felt foreign, like, like it was just another way of living. There were there were things that kind of surprised me, like we weren't allowed to talk about certain things because you know, my aunts were afraid that people were listening in on us, like there were spies everywhere, and so there was a lot of paranoia. Um, and so yeah, that's a really interesting question because I honestly can't remember what I used to think as a child about Vietnam, the country. Um, but I do know that the most recent visit I took, I was kind of, it kind of hit me one day that Vietnam is not as much of an ethnicity as I thought it was. It's actually much more of a nationality nowadays. So, you know, when I went over there, I was sitting at a table and there was somebody who looked white to me, but perhaps mixed. And they have no concept of like they don't put a hyphen like somebody is Korean Vietnamese or Chinese Vietnamese. It's just Vietnamese. Like if you were born there, if your parents were born there, that's all, that's it. And so it was kind of interesting because I pointed out this person and I asked them like, is that person mixed? And they were like, what do you mean? And I was like, is that person full Vietnamese or part? And they said he's full Vietnamese. And then, and then at some point in the conversation, it was like, you're not Vietnamese, but that person is Vietnamese. And so it's much more a nationality than it is about an ethnic background, if you know what I mean. I mean, and then when I brought up the concept of ethnicity, they were like, there are no Vietnamese people, except for the ethnic minorities in Vietnam. Everybody else who's a mainstream Vietnamese person is probably from anywhere, China, Korea, um, Singapore. So yeah, I was all kinds of confused after that visit. And it made me think a lot more about my identity and what it means to be Vietnamese American. Um, yeah, I don't know if that really answered your question.
Oh, it does. Absolutely. I think that's fascinating because America is so different, right? The dominant idea of the all-American boy, let's say, is you know, is very exclusive and leaves all of us out of that picture. And so and so to think that in other places, and especially in a place like Vietnam, where there has been so much division, that there would be, you know, a unity at this point in time, in terms of identity. Where are you now in terms of identity? Both of you, we're gonna get beyond just just Vietnam and identity, but I'm just really curious about where you are now in terms of how you identify and how your artistic practice helped you get there. And for our audience, I'll say that both of you have explored your parents and developed, I think, what seems to me as an outsider, a better understanding of the choices your parents made and the experiences that that inform those choices. and very publicly, carried and maybe shed some of the weight of the intergenerational trauma that you've experienced. And I don't think many artists or many people really do that much work introspectively or or with their parents, and I think that can lead to a very it seems like it can lead to a very solid understanding of who you are and where you come from. So I wonder if you have thoughts about where that all has landed you today. Thao, do you want to start?
I'd love to. I think today I'm lighter than I've ever been, artistically and personally, and I, my last record, Temple, which was released May of last year, was the first work of mine wherein I directly addressed my heritage and my ethnicity, and it was the first time that I was proudly Vietnamese, and that comes, there's a lot of unburdening that had to take place. I grew up in Virginia, in the 80s and 90s, and the emphasis on assimilation, externally and internally, was undeniable, and it took me a long time to celebrate the people I come from, uh, and that it wasn't without it takes a lot to acknowledge an internalized shame. It takes a lot to admit that you have it, and then take the steps necessary to sort of exercise that from your being.
Yeah. Do you feel that you have exercised it?
More so than I ever thought possible. Yeah. It's so funny. It's well, it's not funny, but I think what it took to get there has been, especially in this climate, in the past year, especially in these past few months, it's, I regret what it took to get here, but at the same time, that it won't happen until it's ready. That kind of transformation, that ongoing process of putting the work in, and you won't do that work until you're ready to do it.
Yeah, sometimes until you're forced to, I guess, or until it falls upon you. My-Linh, what about you?
I'm in such a weird place right now, to be completely honest. What you asked about, how does our practice contribute to how we identify now? I think I've been more confused than I have ever been before, which is funny to say, because it's like the older I get, the less I seem to know myself, maybe, or the more I seem to know that there's a lot more that I don't know about myself, if that makes sense. I would say that my practice is primarily in Black dance forms, right? So popping is a Black dance form. It comes from Boogaloo, which is from Oakland. I would consider it the predecessor of turfing, which is another Oakland dance. And so being an Asian American, whatever that means, I'm really coming to terms with that label and figuring out what it is to be a dancer who is not Black and not white, because I feel like as an American person who dances, your options kind of are between the two. You're either into like ballet and modern, or whitewashed jazz, like studio jazz, or you gravitate more towards the very many various dance forms that stem from Black and brown cultures. And it's been tough because, you know, the whole piece around appropriation has come up more and more, and we're just trying to figure out where we stand. Um, and I find it interesting because even, you know, I feel weird appropriating from Asian cultures as well. Like even though my parents are Vietnamese, um, it's still uncomfortable for me to really pull from Vietnamese culture because I don't feel fully, um, I don't know what the right word is, not entitled, but I don't feel fully like that's accessible to me. Um, and so it it's complicated, the whole piece around how I identify myself. Um, be, Primarily because I think Asian Americans are in such a weird place right now. We're like finally talking more about race. I grew up with mostly Asian people and Mexican people, and so I didn't really have to think about race in San Jose. I wasn't really exposed to, um, you know, except school. I wasn't really exposed to whiteness or white supremacy or whatever you want to call it until much later in life. Once I left San Jose and I was kind of in different spaces, then I started to see what this whole institutional racism is about, what they mean by colonialism. And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting time, especially with all of what's going on in the world right now, the past year or two or more. There's a lot of interesting conversations that I find myself kind of just in the intersections of. Like there's a lot of different communities that I cross through, and I feel like a bit of an outsider in all of those communities, and I feel a little bit privy to those communities. So it's just been a lot of navigating.
Yeah, I hear that as a Black person who doesn't dance, right? Who doesn't really, for the most part, listen to rap music, you know, and it is not seeped in what is culturally Black, considered culturally Black in America. I struggle with identity too, and never feel entitled to anything, right? I'm half Black, half white, and I don't feel welcome, whether that's in my head or not, uh, anywhere. And and this has led me to kind of develop this sense, like a pseudo philosophy of individualism as the, like not a negation of race and culture, but as, individualism as the most important thing to appeal to, right, when you're talking to other people, because at the end of the day, everybody's going to interpret whatever you say, whatever happens from their own place. I also, my grandparents lived in San Jose. I spent a lot of time in San Jose, and I lived in Berkeley and Oakland, and went to a school, a very diverse school in Berkeley, and I grew up not thinking about it, because so many of the people who I encountered in the Bay Area looked different from each other, that a dominant culture wasn't clear really when I was a child. So I think that's very interesting. What do you, Thao, what do you think about about individualism? Do you feel connected to a larger community, or do you feel sort of out there on your own?
Up until last year, I felt separate from a lot of things, and um, I think that's been to my benefit, but also to my detriment, because you can see yourself as an individual, but if you're not quite tapped into how you are seen, I think it um, it's not it doesn't give you the full scope of what's at play, uh, and I only very recently, around election time, around the late summer of 2020 was when I started working with Pivot, which is this progressive Vietnamese organization, just helping to get out the vote in Vietnamese American communities throughout the country. And that's where My-Linh and I, first connected. And that was the first time that I felt part of a Vietnamese community. And it was remarkable. And it's something that I never thought I would seek out or be able to find. It just never occurred to me. And so I've been a part of other communities and, that reflect different aspects of my identity. But this one very central part of my identity, I'd never felt at home or that I could be my entire self.
Yeah. You said something in your most recent Tiny Desk performance, something, this is not an exact quote, so I apologize, but something about moving beyond reverence and the respect of tradition and custom and elders when it's contrary to the moral righteousness that we're called to. And that really spoke to me as well, because I do think there's a deep importance to understand what and who came before you, but a need to sort of parse which things are harmful and which things continue to be helpful. And I wonder from each of you, I think finding your identity in that, while trying to tear those things apart can be really difficult. Did you struggle with that, either of you, as you dug into your identity as a Vietnamese American? Did you struggle culturally to separate the things that you felt were harming you or others from the things that you felt were helping? And maybe what were some of those?
It's an emphatic yes on my part, but I'll let My-Linh go.
Yeah, well, a good example of that is the fact that I spent a good 8 years, at least, just in the field of law, trying to be a lawyer, because I I was so scared. I was scared to be an artist. I couldn't not separate myself or my own voice from my parents' voices. Like it astounded me how much I carried them with me everywhere, despite how much rebellion or how much how many secrets I kept from them. It was as if they they did their job. Like they have no idea. They think that I just went AWOL, but really it's been tough finding my own voice, because it just gets buried under all of these things they taught me. And I think, I don't know if all of it was harmful, because I mean, on one level, I could definitely say it was. And then on another level, I felt like it did help me in ways that I didn't acknowledge initially. Like I kind of treated, it was almost as if I treated those things as like an illness or as like something that was wrong with me that I needed to get over or get past. And I think this past year, I've been learning about this whole like self-compassion thing, which is new to me. And one of the things is, you thank some of the toxic or unhealthy habits you've had for the ways in which they have helped you. Otherwise, you would have never adopted them in the first place. And then you say goodbye to them once you feel ready to. But I would say some of the harmful things that also did help propel me were the overworking, I have this really bad habit, I guess. I don't know if I should call it a bad habit. I have this habit of just pushing myself way too hard sometimes and not knowing when to stop. And I know I got that from my mom, because she does some crazy magic sometimes. And just to this day, I don't. Right now, I'm trying to take care of her because she's battling cancer, and I I just have to cook for her, like maybe once a week, maybe twice a week. And it's so hard. I don't know how she did this every single day for 4 children and worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. She would cook 5 dishes every meal. I can't figure it out for the life of me. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah. I think this might actually be a good time to watch the video that we were talking about. Do you want to give a little context for what we're going to watch?
Sure. So I made this piece actually it was intended for a live performance, and then what happened was COVID shut everything down, and so I had to quickly adapt it to film. It's just an excerpt of a much longer piece, and it's titled, depending on whether or not you're Vietnamese. If you're not Vietnamese, it's titled Me Love You Long Time. If you're Vietnamese, it's titled Mẹ I Love You Long Time, Mẹ meaning mother. And it started off as kind of a response to that line, which we all hate. Like, I mean, really hate. And
Really hate.
yeah, I cannot emphasize enough how terrible that line is. But so it was kind of a response to a reclaiming of that line. And I was just linking it back to what I saw in Vietnamese mothers and how much resilience, how much sacrifice. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Great. Okay, bear with me as I share my screen. We'll watch this. It's about 2.5 minutes long, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. And tell me if there are any technical problems, please. That's so beautiful, and you know, I almost feel guilty being an observer to that, because of how personal it feels in a good way, not in an inappropriate way. Thao, you you made a film called Nobody Dies, with and about your parents, that included your mother in the film, and you talked about her hands and how worn they were from her constant work. Does this resonate with you?
Oh, yeah, and incredibly so. It moves me beyond words. I mean, My-Linh, that's incredible what you made, and I thank you for that.
Yeah, it is really incredible, and and there are people in the chat with whom it resonates too. They see themselves and their mothers in there, and similarly, Thao, in I was reading comments on YouTube, your comments, and
that's terrifying. Yeah.
no, but surprisingly, they not surprisingly because of who you are, but surprisingly because it's the internet. There was so much positivity. Because people saw themselves in you, right? You represented and represent who they are, particularly in Temple, where you talk about your you sing about your mother and her experience in Vietnam, and so I wonder, did you have people who you looked up to, who you felt represented you, or if not, who did you look up to that wasn't anything like you, that you aspired to be like?
Um, I, I would say growing up, I looked up to certain people, certain artists that I had access to, which meant they were very mainstream pop culture artists. But I think there was always this void and this dearth of who can I look to for my particular experience. And I want to commend one person in particular who I greatly admire and who kind of shifted, when I was starting to make Temple, the album, Temple it's about being proudly queer and proudly Vietnamese. And that intersection of identity was not something that I didn't know where to look. And I didn't, I wasn't comfortable enough in it to be looking. And it wasn't until I think in 2018, there is a New York Times article in the food section about the Ban Kiêng Collective, which is created and run by Diep Tran or Diep Trang, and she's a queer Vietnamese chef who had started this this group that would gather. It's like a queer affirming group that would celebrate Tet, which is the Lunar Vietnamese New Year, and kind of reclaim and claim and carve out space in this incredibly traditional tradition. And once I read that group even existed there in LA, that was the first inkling I had that there was a place, and all I had to do was just start looking, start existing in the world as myself.
Yeah, it sounds like it sounds like the holistic person, the holistic identity was more important than anything individual or simple, that finding where you fit in, not somebody to be like, or anything, was the important part. Would you say that's true?
Yes, that's incredibly true. Yeah, I think it was getting to the point of self-acceptance, self-compassion, self-celebration, where you can just say, this, and I mean, the road is long, you know,
Yeah.
and the journey is extensive. But that's what it took. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily. Well, I think everyone that I looked to had this courage and this willingness to just be so open.
Yeah.
So you know, it's such simple things, but if you have never done it, you don't know if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My-Linh, what about you? Actually, before you speak, I want to let people know that they're welcome to drop questions into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the last 15 minutes or so of the conversation. But please, by all means, participate with your questions or comments. My-Linh, did you have people who you looked up to, who you thought represented you, or if not, where did you look?
I would say that growing up, I wasn't really allowed to even entertain the thought of being an artist or anywhere near the arts. And so I was kind of stuck playing classical music on the piano for 11 years. all I saw were other Vietnamese kids on pianos or violins. It really wasn't until just the past 5 years that and this is a little bit embarrassing for me, but yeah, it was just in the last 5 years that I started to be introduced to artists. My first one of the first people I met was T Boy, who is the author of The Best We Could Do, and she was just really kind to me. Like we met up for lunch. We had a great conversation, and that's one of the few interactions I've had with other Vietnamese artists. There have been dancers that I've come across, and I think most of us who danced also had other career paths that we were on. So it was just very rare for me to come across a person who has a similar background as me, but then is also like a full-time artist and really going for it. And yeah.
Yeah. So moving away from identity and into art purely, and of course you can't separate the two because you are you. But who do you each make your art for? When you're creating something, are you creating it in a vacuum from an aesthetic space? Are you thinking of a person out there, of an audience, or is it, is it for you and purely your own that you share?
It started, so I've been, and I say this gratefully, and I've been a touring musician for 15 years now, going on. I started playing music when I was 12. I started writing songs, and I taught myself guitar, and that was for myself. And even all of the songs that led up to the first record, I wrote for myself. And then, luckily and unluckily, they often say some artists are glad that professional success doesn't find them till later because they've had time to develop their voice. I don't believe that I had time. I don't believe that I had that time to develop my voice on my own without this impending doom of self-consciousness and trying to succeed, kind of within my corner of indie rock. So after that first record, I began to write. Everything I did was in service of this idea of the audience and how can I get to the next level? How will there be? What will the music writers like? All this, all that nonsense. And it's only probably till the last record when I have started to regain, and when you are able to build a career, other people's careers and livelihoods and interests intertwine with yours, and then it's really easy to lose sight and focus on why you started in the first place. And I believe that I lost sight so much so that I began to hate music. And it's only very recently that I've come back to it and remembered, when I make music now, I believe my ideas are good and they're there because I want them to be there. And now I'm the primary audience again.
That's so interesting. I think as an artist myself, I find that I get to a point where I hate I hate whatever it is that I loved that led me to start it in the first place. And and I sometimes I wonder if that's just a process that artists go through to get back to it, or if it's a real problem with the way that art is presented and the way that artists are put to work. And I don't know the answer. What about you, My-Linh? Who do you make what you make for?
I mean, I was gonna say I can really relate to what Tao just said. As a dancer who practices primarily popping, it's a very technique-driven dance style, and it's very male-dominated. So I would say the popping culture is so much about like drilling technique and hitting hard and battling and proving your worth. And it gets to a point where there have definitely been times where I just hated it because it's not about dancing anymore. It's not about the fun or the joy of dancing. It's not about feeling good in the music. It becomes about competition and in a weird way, I guess, capitalism, because you're really just trying to make it. And so that's to answer that. To go back to the question you asked about who do I make my work for, I think it just varies depending on what work we're talking about. Like the most recent project was the Mudwater film, my first film that I directed and wrote. And that was for, I would say that I had the turfing community in mind when I wrote that film. And I was tired of seeing the same dance movies. I wanted a dance film that I would enjoy watching. So I guess I made it for myself too. I made it for myself, but with the turfing community in mind and in my heart. And yeah, it just really varies depending on the work we're talking about. I think with the May I Love You Long Time work, that was more for me as well, but also for people who had maybe similar family traumas and needed to kind of have a space or something to process that. Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of Mudwater, I just want to let people know that that KQED will be hosting a drive-in at Fort Mason where there will be a screening of Mudwater in person. So I'm very excited about that. You can find that at kqed.org/events. And Thao, is Nobody Dies up and available? That was premiered on KQED several years ago, but I'm not sure where it is right now.
Right now, I think it definitely exists. Well, we brought it back for a fundraiser for Pivot. So it is online right now, available on my social media.
Great.
And it's up there for now, yeah.
I highly recommend that people go out and watch it while they still can before Thao takes it.
That's right, yeah, I'm very mercurial. I don't know, yeah.
We don't know what you're gonna do. Okay, so let's get to some of these questions. The first one is, where can we watch Nobody Dies? What advice can you give the next generation of Vietnamese and Southeast Asian youths looking for community and solidarity in their creative endeavors? That's from Danny Lee.
My-Linh, you want to go first?
Oh man, that's You know, I feel like I should have a list ready of all of the organizations and things that I know about. But
Well,
yeah.
what would you say to the just in general the next generation of artists, you know, who are trying to discover their practice and try to make their art, their work, you know, whatever they discover their identity to be. What are some stepping stones? What are some good first steps to help people figure out what to do?
Well, I would say one of the major breakthroughs I had, and this might come off as a little bit vague, but I really had to let go of this idea of being better, like getting better, growing better, and focus more on becoming more of myself. And so I think for everybody, that's going to be very different how you get there and how um, how that shows up. But for me, it was just getting rid of that. That first step was getting rid of that need to progress and see this linear progression in my work. I think I really had to accept that sometimes it's, a major zigzag, or you're just all over the place. You start going down one path and then you jump and you go on another path, and it's not the worst thing. I think a lot of the times we're told we're supposed to stick to something and really see it all the way through. And I think exploration is a really important thing to do. I mean, if you feel inclined to, you don't have to either.
For you, do you think that dance was inevitable, or do you think that it just happened to come along at the right time, and that's what you stuck to? Do you think you could have ended up as a different kind of artist?
It was definitely inevitable. I have such early memories as a really young child wanting to dance and then not being able to because the adults wouldn't let me, like they wouldn't allow me to take a class. So it really wasn't until I was old enough to drive myself and then I could sneak off to dance classes and dance practices. But yeah, I think there are some things there's a part of you that really just needs to come out, and it's that thing.
Yeah, Tao, do you feel the same?
I do. About which thing? I do want
About,
both, but I wanted to elaborate on.
yeah, about the inevitability of where you ended up.
I believe it was inevitable that I would pursue art and expression, because I think it was inevitable that I needed to communicate and feel less isolated. And I think if I weren't making music, I would be writing or exploring filmmaking or some multimedia art. And I think that was inevitable. And I wanted to go back to that question of, for a young artist, what are some tips? I think finding people whose art you admire, who are down to earth and who are generous and willing to share and be in community with you, and just working side by side, people who have the same values, and who prioritize work and discipline in the same way is really helpful. I I wanted to say, like, along with My-Linh, you should reach out to T Bui. She's
She's in here.
She's in here. I know. I saw, and I was like, you know what? She really helps artists.
Hey, we're gonna send people her way.
Yeah. She's so busy. She's gonna be like, why did you don't send any more people my way.
T, just drop your phone number in the chat. And people will call you.
But I think, as someone who grew up and I didn't collaborate with anyone, and I didn't, as a self-taught musician, that's different from having that more formal education, and I always felt a bit alienated from that world. And so it took me a long time to, yeah, I think it's, I had the confidence in myself to start, and then it's really easy to lose that along the way. But you just got to remember that your ideas are good. You have to believe in what you make and your instincts when you make them, because you can have other people weigh in regarding the technical aspects of it and the technique, like we were talking about. But that's not, they don't know your vision, and they don't know the emotional landscape. They don't know what you can bring. And they're not going to help you execute that the way, you have to be in control of your vision and your motivation.
I think that's so important. When I never became a professional musician, but I've played music for a long time, and made music quietly by myself. And I, for the longest time, I was afraid to share anything that I made because I had no training, and what I made didn't sound like what I heard. And as I grew as an artist, I came to recognize, well, if something doesn't sound like what you've heard, that's in fact a good thing, because you're providing something new. And I would, similarly, I would say, really just believe in yourself. You might make something terrible, but you might make something great, and nobody's going to die either way. I think that's,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the lesson there. So we have another one who says, I'm really interested in the generational trauma. What does generational or intergenerational trauma mean to you? How has that trauma manifested in your lives, and how has it influenced your self-discovery and your art? So that's a big question, and with with maybe 10 minutes left, we can't answer that. I will let you get to it. But I will say that Thao, you do speak about that in Nobody Dies, and My-Linh, in April Dembosky's piece about you and your parents on KQED, called My Double Life. We hear quite a bit about that, but you were both a bit removed from those, and I wonder if you have any brief thoughts on that from your perspective today.
Briefly, I would say that the trauma that my parents have or are still, holding, it's much more than I thought it was. There's the whole piece about the war and the violence and the loss from the war, and then the whole journey on the boat that was really frightening. Like, all those things are really, may have put them in a permanent fight or flight mode, but there's so much more to it that I'm still discovering, like just the trauma of losing your kids to an American identity, like that slow process of seeing this gap between you and your kids, the language barrier, stuff like that, where it's now just kind of unraveling for me, and I'm putting myself in their shoes, because I'm about to be the age they were when I was born. So I'm getting there. I'm starting to really see myself as my parents, and I'm starting to see their humanities more as I get older. Whereas, for the longest time, I just kept seeing them as these figures that didn't make sense to me. But
yeah, Thao, what about you?
I think what probably the most overt example of that kind of trauma and how it plays out generationally is, and my album before Temple was A Man Alive, and I talk about this in the documentary. It's sort of hard to not talk about, but I don't have a relationship with my father, and A Man Alive is an entire album about growing up with him until I was 12, but the incredible turbulence and a really brutal abusive environment. And I think so much of that is, you know, what people are capable of or incapable of when they can't fully process what has happened to them. And I think that was part of his problem. And then that very much became our problems as well. You know, like you know, when you've lost your country and you've lost so much, and then you are trying to settle in a new place. But I believe that the emasculation of men is so dangerous for their families. And that's, you know, that's one of the tougher things I've had to grapple with and make sense of and make peace with.
Yeah. Do either of you think about forgiveness, or is that something that enters into the calculus, or you know, is the pain and were the acts too much for that? And maybe that's a question you don't have to answer right here, right now, but I'm just personally curious.
Yeah. You know, my parents are getting to that age where I feel like I only have so many years left with them, and I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I want to spend those last few years. So the forgiveness thing is interesting because it's almost tied to a lot of the things that I've been angry at myself about. Like, you know, when I feel like I picked up on some of my dad's characteristics or personality traits, you know, I used to beat myself up for that. Like, oh God, I'm just like my dad, or I'm just like my mom. And yeah, I mentioned earlier that the past year I've been learning more about self-compassion. And I think that the more I learn to forgive myself, the more I'm able to forgive my parents. It's kind of like this back and forth thing. And it goes really deep. Like there's a lot that I didn't know I was mad at my parents about. It goes kind of beyond how they treated me at times, and the excuses I used to make for that. And then, you know, it is a lot of, it's so layered, and it's just such a big topic that I feel bad that I can only say so much right now so quickly. But I'll just say that it's an ongoing process, and forgiveness it's not just about doing it for them, but it's also about doing it for yourself. You know, like you're healing, and as you're healing yourself, maybe you're also healing them a little bit as well. Like, I mean, there's a lot they have to take responsibility for, but it's an interesting process. I think the healing process is really complicated. And
yeah. Thao, do you want to talk about that?
I agree with everything My-Linh said. I think personally, I am way more open to forgiveness now, and I think I put myself, and you know, I've been through the ringer enough now that I would just love to be free. So I do it for myself mostly, you know, to move on. But it's really, you know, the past few months especially have been so intense to see elders in the Asian community suffer and be so afraid and be subject to this horrendous violence. And so it kind of, you know, gives you this additional perspective that you already were getting with just getting older and mortality, you know, and then COVID, and then this additional layer of really petrifying uncertainty around this. You know, that made me think I'll call him because I don't want it to, that's not how I want it to go down, you know.
Yeah.
And it becomes very simple in those terms. Like there's so many things outside of our control. And we are also vulnerable in ways we already thought we were vulnerable, but now it's just this next level.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There are a number of people who are thanking you for your honesty and your vulnerability. I think it's really beautiful. We are just about at our time, so I'll let you go in just a minute. But I wanted to thank you again for being here, for sharing so openly. I think it's so important for people to hear other people talk about their artistic practices and how their lives inform that, because I know, as a child, as a youth, I didn't hear that. And when people open up in this way, it's so validating to what happens in your head that's only yours. And so your work and this conversation, I think, goes a long way toward helping people become themselves, which is a really important thing to be. Before we go, I just want to give you both an opportunity to share what you're working on, or what's available for people to watch, or where you want us to point eyes and ears right now. Thao, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm right now, if you go to taofortherecord.community, I'm documenting the making of my next record.
That's
it's a
great.
little newsletter. I'll email you every week.
Cool. taofortherecord.community.
Mm-hmm.
My-Linh?
I feel like you've already helped me about what's going on. So there's just the drive-in screening of Mudwater, a preview screening of Mudwater. I'm really bad at this. I never remember what I'm doing. So maybe just follow me on Instagram.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is My-Linh, MYLINHIE.
That's fantastic. Well, I just want you to know that that everybody at KQED loves you both so much, and they were all very excited that this was happening, and we, once we get back to in-person things, we would love to find a way to have both of you back separately or together if you want to collaborate on something. I think that would be really cool. So thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Sorry if we didn't get to your questions. There are a lot of great questions out there that we didn't get to, but please engage with Thao and My-Linh on social media. Keep your eyes out on kqed.org and kqed.org/events for everything that's coming up. And everybody have a great night. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.